Good to be with all of you again. We are now in chapter 15 and dealing with the war between the states. We're going to do that in two lectures. So this is the first part of the war that's going to carry us from essentially May of 1861 through November of 1862. So the first phase of the war. This lecture and the next lecture on the Civil War will be our final two lectures for the test that is upcoming. There will be a third lecture on Reconstruction, which you will need to listen to and send me answers to the questions that are part of that lecture, but the material on that lecture will not be part of the test. So just like we were still in class, final night of the semester, you are going to come in, take your test, and then hear a lecture. Obviously, it won't work quite that way now. What we're going to do instead is let you take the test and then listen to that final lecture. Your window to listen to it and get the answers back to me is going to be fairly short because the grades have to be turned in not long after our official last night of class. But as soon as these two Civil War lectures are posted, I'm going to put the essay questions out. Want to give you the maximum amount of time to see the videos, to answer the questions, to write your essays. A lot of you need to send me sample thesis paragraphs or outlines so that I can help you better craft your essays on this last test. Very important since most of you are still on the improvement system, which of course means that you have this great opportunity to do your best work on the last test and let your best work therefore become your test grade. And as always, if you have questions or concerns, you need to email me. Let's stay in touch because that is the only way that I can help you out. So where are we? Well, the war has broken out. The war has broken out at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. President Lincoln has issued a call for 75,000 three-month volunteers to put down what he calls the rebellion. He's also, of course, called for 30,000 or so volunteers for a longer time period. But Lincoln, like almost everybody else, believes that this war is going to be fairly short. And not so necessarily Jefferson Davis, who believes that the war could be much longer than anybody expected. The Confederacy is enlisting its troops for a year's worth of service, but neither side has much trouble getting manpower. Men rush to enlist. There's a great deal of enthusiasm, and although this is encouraging for both sides, of course, it's also a problem for both sides because they're starting from standing still. The Union Army, when the war broke out, was only 16,000 men strong. The Navy has a relative handful of ships. A lot of the Army's officers and the Navy's officers have resigned to go south when their states leave the Union. And on both sides, finding uniforms and equipment, tents, wagons to carry the supplies, the horses, the mules, the harnesses, the medicines, all these things are going to be incredibly difficult. You're going to have to send agents to Europe scrambling to buy that stuff. It's going to take a while for manufacturing to get going. And in this regard, of course, the Union is much better off than the South. It has much greater population, 32 million as opposed to 9 million for the Confederates, and 4 million of those are slaves. And although tens of thousands of blacks will serve in the Confederate Army, they will do so as laborers, as teamsters, and that sort of thing. Very few of them will carry weapons, although at the very tail end of the war, as the Confederacy's fortunes are waning, the Southerners make the decision that their independence is more important than slavery, and they'll pass a law in March of '65 enabling the enlistment of African Americans. The North will have done that, of course, a couple of years earlier, and by the time the war comes to an end, there will be almost more African Americans in the Federal Army than there will be men left in the Confederate Army, but all that lay in the future. At this point, the problem is getting these armies organized, getting them equipped, getting them trained. That's especially challenging since there aren't nearly enough professional military officers to go around. The South was very lucky that it got a lot of West Pointers. and men from places like the Virginia Military Institute and the North Carolina or the Georgia Military Institutes, that sort of thing. Anybody who had any previous military experience was very much welcomed into the cause, but there weren't enough of them to go around. So there were a lot of men who were appointed for political reasons, as had been the case in all previous American wars. And really, what choice did you have? You've got to find leaders somewhere. So prominent local citizens who had helped raise a company of troops, politicians, sometimes even clergymen, newspaper editors on occasion. These were the people who became captains and majors and lieutenant colonels and sometimes even generals. And many of them will serve competently, some of them will serve brilliantly, and not a few of them will be disasters for their respective side. But this is something both parties are grappling with. In terms of overall resources, of course, the North has got a much better hand to play than the South. It has vastly more industrial capacity. It has more money. Its population actually will grow over the course of war as immigration from Europe continues. The South is not going to have that advantage. The North has far more food production than the South does, although, of course, the Confederates are going to switch from growing cotton to growing food. That will make up for this to some extent. Southerners a little bit better equipped for horses and mules, but the North is going to manage to handle that as well. Of course, the North has infinitely more shipbuilding capacity than the South does. The Confederates do capture the Norfolk Navy Yard when Virginia secedes, which is going to be much to their advantage, although the Federals are going to recapture it in the summer of 1862. So the South's not going to have that for very long. The same story with places like Memphis and New Orleans, which could be shipbuilding centers for the South, but the Confederates lack the industrial capacity to make engines and steam engines for warships and things like propellers and propeller shafts. And although the Confederate Navy is going to be very ingenious, it's going to pioneer the use of the ironclad warship. It's going to pioneer the use of the naval mine in this war called the torpedo. It's going to build the first operational submarine and the first submarine that's going to sink an enemy vessel in combat. That's the CSS Hunley that's going to sink the USS Housatonic off of Charleston in 1863. The Confederates are going to have to rely a lot on forts that they build along the Mississippi River, the Cumberland, the Tennessee River, and forts that they build to protect their harbors and their ports. They're simply not going to have enough naval power to do that. The Union blockade, which in the beginning is kind of pathetic. There are very few ships. The Union Navy is going to have to build up enormously, but the North has the capacity to do that, not only to build men of war, but to rent or to buy civilian ships, convert them into warships, sometimes with just a few guns on them, but that's enough to be a blockader, to be able to intimidate or shoot up a vessel that is trying to slip through the Federal blockade with supplies. And by the end of the war, the North's going to have a navy of over 600 ships. The Confederates are going to respond by sending commerce raiders out onto the high seas, and they're going to give the United States government a great fits. And a lot of these ships, like the CSS Alabama and the CSS Shenandoah, are going to be remarkably successful at waging guerrilla warfare against Union maritime commerce. But again, these are kind of pinpricks on the hide of the northern elephant. One of the biggest advantages the North has is railroads. There's far more railroad mileage in the North than there is in the South, and the North has the capacity to build locomotives and railway cars and to produce rails and cross ties. This is something that the South really does not have. The Confederate railroad network was fairly sparse, and it will grow more brittle as the war goes on. The Confederates will not produce a single locomotive over the course of the war. And this matters a great deal because, of course, railroads go places that rivers can't. And in the West, That's going to be exceptionally important, and the railroads are going to be a focal point of military movements because supplies move by rail, troops move by rail. And so railroad junctions, railroad lines are going to be fought for and fought for with great vigor by both sides who need the railroads in order to keep their armies going. Another thing that's going to be very different about this war as opposed to previous wars is the importance of the telegraph. The telegraph, which has been invented and become common in the 1840s and the 1850s, is a vital military tool for operational and strategic communication. It's something that's never been seen in warfare before. Another thing that this war is going to innovate is weaponry. So most troops in the war are going to use muzzle-loading, single-shot rifles, but these are rifles, not muskets, so they are more accurate, longer range. They are percussion, not flintlock, which means they will work in all types of weather, unlike the old flintlocks, which didn't work if it was damp or snowing or rainy, something like that. You'll also have rifled artillery. You will see widespread use of breech loading and eventually repeating firearms. Things like the Gatling gun are going to be invented and experimented with, although they're never going to be really used on Civil War battlefields. And landmines are even going to make an appearance in this war. Primitive and not used in lots of places, but they are going to be out there. Trenches, field fortifications, and primitive versions of barbed wire, where you would take telegraph wire and you would string it out low on the ground to be a trip hazard to attacking troops. Barbed wire is not going to be invented until the 1870s, but this is its military precursor, if you will, so that by the time that we get into 1864, the Civil War is becoming sort of a dress rehearsal for World War I. So a lot of military innovation. One of the things that's going to come out of the war is the modern medical system of triage and evacuation. It's going to be developed by the medical director of the Union's Army of the Potomac, Jonathan Letterman. This business of collecting casualties, evaluating them, triaging them, who needs immediate surgery, who can be sent to the rear to have surgery later, who's not going to make it and can be set off to die and made as comfortable as possible while that's happening. That modern system that we have today for dealing with disasters and mass casualty events and stuff, that all comes out of the American Civil War, as well as a host of other inventions. All of this is laying ahead, but of course nobody knows that. What they do know is that they expect a quick war. There's got to be one in a single, maybe 2 or 3 really big battles, and it seems pretty obvious that the first of those big battles is going to take place in Virginia. The Confederates have moved their capital from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia, following Virginia's secession. Richmond is a vitally important city for the Confederates. It is a major industrial hub. It will be the Confederate capital, and it sits only 100 miles from Washington, D.C., and so this is considered a great affront to the Union for the rebels to put their capital that close to the capital of the Federal Republic. And so there is enormous pressure put on the Lincoln administration to capture Richmond, and rightly or wrongly, the capture of Richmond is going to become one of the focal points of Union military efforts in the West, or rather in the East. In the West, you still have Kentucky's neutrality, which is more of a benefit for the Confederates than it is for the Federals, because it creates a great big buffer between Union territory and Tennessee. The border of Kentucky and Tennessee doesn't have a river. It doesn't have any real natural obstacle to aid in its defense. Interesting thing, in Virginia, all the rivers basically run from northwest to southeast, and so they run in front of any Union advance from Washington toward Richmond. And each of those rivers are a line of defense. In the West, the rivers tend to run north to south. Certainly the Mississippi does, but you have rivers like the Tennessee and the Cumberland. They flow into the Ohio, but if you look at them on a map, they run south from the Ohio through Kentucky into Tennessee and northern Alabama and Mississippi. And these are natural avenues of invasion that the North, with its superior shipbuilding capacity, is going to be able to utilize. The Union's going to build a lot of specialized warships for use on the western waters, broad beam, shallow draft, several of them ironclad, at least around their machinery and their gun ports, and along with transport ships and even hospital ships. These are going to give the Union a strategic mobility that the South is going to be hard-pressed to meet. For the Confederates in the East, they have the advantage that most of their military academy graduates tended to wind up there. And so the Confederate armies there from the very beginning were better drilled, better trained, and in many instances better led. The Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi are always going to be somewhat makeshift. They're going to be at the far end of the supply line, and more they're going to have to make do for themselves. And the Confederate armies in the Western theater, between the Mississippi and the Appalachian Mountains, are going to also be very hard-pressed for men, for materiel, for weapons, and this is a problem for the general who's put in charge of the Confederate forces trying to hold on to Tennessee, and that is the Texas general by the name of Albert Sidney Johnston. Johnston was a good friend of Jefferson Davis, who admired him mightily, thought he was probably the best general that the Confederacy had, and Johnston was charged with defending Tennessee and the Mississippi River Valley, and he only had something like 50,000 troops to do that, and not even enough weapons for all of those men. And he knew that he was vastly outnumbered, and that if the North began to use that manpower advantage, he was going to be overwhelmed very quickly. Kentucky's neutrality in this sense was a godsend, but Johnston recognized that sooner or later Kentucky's neutrality was going to fall by the wayside. One way or another, it was going to collapse, and with the North's control of naval forces on the western rivers, they could strike deep into the Confederacy almost any time they wanted, and he needed time. He needed time in order to manage to hold those, or to build up his forces and make it possible for him to get better prepared. And so he basically staged a giant bluff. What he did was to give very confident reports to the newspapers. I've got plenty of men, I got plenty of supplies, got plenty of weapons. He made it sound like it was very, very strong. And this did fool the North for quite some time. It made federal generals incredibly timid. That's going to buy Albert Sidney Johnston some time. Of course, it's going to do him no favors when his bluff is finally exposed for what it is, and all the confidence that he's built up is amongst the Southern press and the Southern people is going to prove to have been a mirage, and his reputation is going to suffer. But for the moment, this is something of a brilliant move. But as the armies in the West are gathering together and really can't get at each other because of Kentucky neutrality and because they haven't built the warships and this sort of stuff, then the focus is on the East. And here, the North has built an army of about 35,000 men around Washington, D.C. It's under the command of Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. And McDowell, like every other general in this war, is a novice at commanding armies. So you got to remember, the largest army that we've had in American history up to this point is George Washington's army on Long Island in 1776 that had at one point between 24 and 28,000 men. That's as big as the Continental Army that we're going to get. Winfield Scott's army that conquered Mexico City was 14,000 men. Civil War armies are routinely going to be 50,000 men, 70,000 men. When we start looking at Northern armies, especially in the Virginia theater, 100,000 men, 120,000 men. And so, most of your officers have at best command commanded a few thousand troops, most of them only a few hundred troops. And so everybody's learning on the job, the enlisted man as well as the general and everybody in between. In fact, the officers very often on regimental and brigade levels stayed up at night reading the military manuals to learn the lessons that the next day they were going to try and teach their troops. So everybody's green. It's going to take everybody a long time to learn the ropes, and this made General McDowell very hesitant to advance. Even though the newspapers were screaming, "On to Richmond, we have to capture the Confederate capital," McDowell said, "Look, my army isn't prepared to stage an offensive." Opposed to him was a Confederate army of about 20,000 men. It was stationed roughly 25 miles away from Washington, D.C., around a railroad junction called Manassas Junction, which was near a little creek called Bull Run. And that army was under the command of General Beauregard, who, of course, was the victor at Fort Sumter, and his army was blocking any Union advance into Virginia. It would be the logical target of McDowell when the time came, and McDowell was reluctant for that time to come, but Lincoln was aware that the enlistments of a lot of McDowell's troops were about to expire. The men had signed up for 3 months back in April, and here we are, and it's June, and if you don't use them soon, they're all going to get to go home, and they probably will, and you're going to have to start rebuilding your army all over again. And McDowell says, "Look, my troops are green," and Lincoln, who's got a lot to learn as a commander-in-chief and learns pretty quickly, but he makes a lot of mistakes along the way, Lincoln basically says, "Well, yeah, that's true, you're green, but the Confederates are green too. You were all green alike." And so under pressure, McDowell is finally forced to launch an offensive, and he marches out of Washington on July 16th, heading toward the Confederates. It's a 25-mile march. Later in the war, troops would do that in a single day. But everybody is still very new at this. The Army, the Union Army advances very cautiously, very carefully, scouting ahead of it, afraid of an ambush. Of course, there are all kinds of logistical issues, and the troops aren't hardened to long marches in the hot summer sun. They're not going to get to Bull Run until July 21st, where they will finally engage the Confederates in the war's first big battle. The North will call it the Battle of Bull Run. The South will call it the Battle of Manassas, and you will find several instances where Civil War battles have two names, one Southern name, one Union name, and that's because Southerners tended to name their battles after the nearest town or railroad junction, so Manassas. Federals tend to name their battles after the nearest body of water, so Bull Run Creek. It's not always the case, but it happens more often than you might think. There were, of course, more forces in Virginia than just McDowell's army heading toward Manassas and Beauregard's army waiting for them there. On the other side of the Bull Run Mountains, you have the Shenandoah Valley. And one of the things, of course, is very hard to do in an online lecture like this is to talk about military things without maps. And so I'm going to be emailing you maps for you to look at as we talk about the war. And so, reference those as you're listening to the lectures, and things will make a lot more sense. But basically, you have Manassas over here. You have the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and on this side you have the Shenandoah Valley. And the Shenandoah Valley basically runs northeast to southwest. So a Union army that's traveling the length of the valley is really going away from Richmond, but a Confederate army that's moving up the valley is headed toward Washington. So that makes the Shenandoah a military highway for the South. It's also an exceptionally bountiful region. And a lot of the food that the Confederate armies in Virginia are going to eat during the war is going to come from the Shenandoah. There's a Confederate army of roughly 10 or 12,000 men in the Shenandoah under the command of a Virginian by the name of Joseph E. Johnston. There are railroads that link the Shenandoah Valley to Manassas Junction. The Confederates could move reinforcements to Beauregard very quickly along those rail lines, and so it's very important that Johnston not be able to do that, and orders are given to a Union army in the Shenandoah under a general by the name of Robert Patterson, who's a retread from the Mexican War, a very elderly general from Pennsylvania. He's supposed to keep Joe Johnston busy, so he can't reinforce Beauregard. And in this, Patterson fails for a host of reasons, some good, some poor, and Johnston is able to transfer a lot of troops to Beauregard, some of whom actually get off the boxcars and march right into the battle, which is a first in military history. The Battle of Bull Run is the first great clash, and the Federals are the attackers. At first, they do very well. They turn the Confederate flank, and they look like they're about to win the battle. But eventually, the inexperience of the Federal forces turns against them. The longer the day goes on, the more confusing things get. The Federal forces attack piecemeal. The Confederates are able to withstand the blows, but at the crisis of the battle, when it looks like one last Federal attack is going to win today, the Yankees run into a brigade of Virginians under the command of a West Pointer, a Mexican War veteran who had also been a professor of artillery at the Virginia Military Institute, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. And Jackson is going to turn out to be a tough cookie for the North to deal with. And so his brigade makes a stand. It blunts the Federal advance. Another Confederate officer trying to rally his troops points toward Jackson and says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." And at that point, Jackson gets a nickname. He becomes Stonewall Jackson. And that is how he will go down into the history books. Eventually, the Federal attack falters. The Confederates counterattack. They drive the Union troops from the field. And as they begin to retreat toward Washington, their withdrawal turns into a rout. Hundreds, maybe thousands of citizens from D.C., some of them congressmen, and ladies in their hoop skirts and coming out in the carriages, had followed the Union Army into Virginia to watch the great battle as though it was a sporting event. And so they had picnicked on the hillsides trying to see what was going on at Manassas. And when the Union Army began to retreat, of course, these people panicked and they helped clog the roads. There was a little creek called Cub Run that the Federals and all these fleeing spectators had to get over. Had a single bridge. A Confederate shell knocked over a wagon on that bridge, blocked the wagon, panic ensued, and the Federal Army basically began to come apart. And if it took it 5 days to get Manassas, it took it 1 day to get back to Washington, D.C. And this debacle at Bull Run was a great humiliation for the North. It sort of sobered Lincoln up. This war is not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. He called for even more 2- and 3-year volunteers. These men, of course, will be coming in. The battle at Bull Run made the Confederates perhaps a little bit overconfident, but they had won the first big contest, and not just here. Way out in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, there's fighting going along the southern border of Missouri, where it meets Arkansas, and on August 10th of 1861 at a place called Wilson's Creek, a combined force of Missouri troops under General Sterling Price and Confederate troops under an old Texas Ranger by the name of Ben McCullough managed to defeat a Federal force at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So that this first 6 months of the war, the South seems to be winning the battles. And one of the interesting things about the Civil War is that you're going to see a real pendulum swing. The South will do really well for a handful of months, and then the North will begin to do really well for a handful of months, and then you'll have a stalemate, and the pendulum will swing backward and forward like this, and things begun to come apart for the Confederates by the time you get to the beginning of 1862. So like everybody's armies are still building, they're getting better, and the supply lines are getting put in place, and the manufacturing is gearing up and that kind of thing. But this business of Kentucky neutrality continues to vex both sides. Now, Kentucky neutrality in a way was kind of a facade, because each side set up recruiting offices just across the border. The Federals on the other side of the Ohio, the Confederates just inside Tennessee. Tens of thousands of men from Kentucky will go fight for the North and for the South. And both sides, of course, recognize that Kentucky's neutrality cannot last very long. One of the most important things in the Western theater is to take control of the Mississippi River. As long as the Confederates hold it, they have continuity between the Trans-Mississippi and the rest of the Confederacy, and of course they have the use of the river, and they deny use of that river to the North, not just militarily, but economically, where the goods of the Midwest have to flow down the Ohio and down the Mississippi and go out into the world markets from New Orleans. That can't happen as long as the Confederates control the Mississippi. And although the Confederates do try and build a couple of ironclads, they don't have the industrial capacity to finish them before the Federals come a-calling, and therefore they put together a couple of small fleets of Mississippi River steamboats, and they have a couple of guns. They're actually going to fight rather credibly, but they're going to be hopelessly overmatched. But control of the river is a focal point, and both sides understand that means Kentucky's neutrality is doomed, because the Ohio flows into the Mississippi at the northwest tip of Kentucky, which of course is very close to the northwest tip of Tennessee. Federal forces are assembling in Cairo, Illinois, which was an important shipbuilding center just across the river from Paducah, Kentucky, at the point where the Ohio meets the Mississippi. Confederate forces were not very far away, and they were under the command of General Leonidas Polk. And Polk, who had been an Episcopal minister before the war, a bishop actually, although he was West Point trained, he had left the military to go into the clergy. Polk got wind that these Union forces, who were commanded by a Illinois brigadier by the name of Ulysses S. Grant, were about to seize Paducah. And Polk was afraid that the Federals were going to get a jump on him. They would get control of this critical western tip of Kentucky, and he couldn't let that happen. And militarily, of course, he was quite right. The Federals were intending to do this, but Polk decided to beat them to the punch. And so without getting permission from Albert Sidney Johnston, who was his commander, or permission from the Davis administration, Polk decided to invade Kentucky. And so September 4th, he moves into Kentucky to seize Columbus, which he fortifies. It's overlooking the river, of course, and militarily, not a bad move, but it means that the Confederates are the first to violate Kentucky's neutrality, and that tilts the political field in favor of those who want to keep Kentucky in the Union. And although the Kentuckians, like the people in Missouri and Maryland, will have a Confederate government in exile, and they'll have seats in the Confederate Congress and stars of the Confederate flag, Kentucky now is pretty firmly in the Union camp, just like Maryland was. And of course, once Polk moves in, the green light is given for the Federals to move in, and Grant crosses the river. He seizes Paducah. Federal forces come over the Ohio to get the state capital at Frankfort. They get Lexington. They get Louisville. Albert Sidney Johnston advances northward to take up a line in central Kentucky. His left flank is at Columbus on the Mississippi. His center is at a place called Bowling Green, and his right flank is at a place called Mill Springs. And of course, Albert Sidney Johnston's bluff is now at great risk because the Federals can come at him, and although they still believe that he has these massive numbers of well-armed troops, the reality is very different. And as soon as the Yankees test that reality, the facade of Confederate strength in the West is going to fall apart, and that happens in mid-January of 1862 on the eastern flank of Albert Sidney Johnston's line. There's a little battle at a place called Mill Springs. There's a fight. It's very small. But the Confederate forces there are defeated. Their commanding officer killed in the engagement. In large part, they're beaten not just because they're outnumbered and poorly, although gallantly led. They have flintlock muskets early in the war, and the battle's fought in a driving rainstorm, so the Confederate muskets don't work. The Federals have percussion muskets that do work in the rain. And so the Confederates are beaten. And at this point, Albert Sidney Johnston knows that he's got to abandon Kentucky and pull back into Tennessee. He's too spread out. He can't meet various federal thrusts that are coming at him from the west and from the center as well as from the east. And that means he's got to pull back into Tennessee, which has not got any kind of natural barrier for its defense. In fact, two rivers, the Tennessee and the Cumberland, actually come down through western Kentucky right into Tennessee. One of them, of course, leads right by the state capital of Nashville, and so the Cumberland River does. And so the Confederates had, in the early days of the war, before Kentucky's neutrality was going to evaporate, had to build forts to defend these two rivers. And one of them was Fort Henry, which was on the Tennessee River, and Fort Donelson, which was on the Cumberland. And as these forts went, so went the safety of Nashville. The Federals knew that, and in early February of 1862, a Union Army under Grant, supported by a Union fleet under Flag Officer Commodore Foote, attacked these two Confederate forts. They captured Fort Henry on February 6th. Fort Henry was poorly sited. It was on low ground. The river was flooding as the Confederate infantry had already evacuated it. And although there was a sharp battle between Union gunboats and Confederate artillery, the Federals triumphed very easily there. And at that point, Grant marched his army overland to go after Fort Donelson. The Federal Navy did the same. Fort Donelson was better built. It was on a high ground. It was able to repulse a Union naval attack. And Grant decided that he was going to have to besiege the place that had a Confederate army of maybe 20,000 men. It would take a while. He'd have to starve it into surrender. The Confederate commanders there recognized that a siege was not going to work for them, that they would be trapped and eventually forced to surrender. So they attempted to fight their way out of encirclement, and they actually managed to open a gap to escape. A very well-conducted assault to swing a door open through the Union lines, but at the last moment, the Confederate commanders there, who were political generals, lost their nerve, and they decided to pull back within the fort, at which point Grant slammed their escape hatch shut. He had managed to capture some of their fortifications while they were all trying to, at least for a while, fight their way out. The Confederate position was now perfectly helpless, and they were forced to ask for terms of surrender. And Grant's response made him very famous because he said no terms except unconditional surrender, which of course matched his initials, U.S. The Confederates had to capitulate. Some 17,000 rebels were captured. The North now has its first really great victories of the war at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Within 10 days, Nashville is captured by Federal troops, and Johnston is forced to abandon all of central Tennessee and pull his army back into northern Mississippi, where it comes to a halt around the vital railroad junction of Corinth. And so disaster here. in the Western theater for the Confederates. And of course, Albert Sidney Johnston is blamed for all of this. His bluff has been called, and all of the reassuring things he had said to fool the Yankees into believing he was overly strong had also, of course, fooled the Southern people, who were shocked at these defeats. In the Eastern theater, things are not moving so fast. So after the defeat at Bull Run and the rout of the Union Army under McDowell, the Lincoln administration had turned to a Union general by the name of George B. McClellan. McClellan, another West Pointer, he graduated second in his class, but had left the military fairly soon to become a very successful and famous railroad executive. He came back into uniform once the war began. McClellan had led Union forces in a brief campaign to capture the mountains of western Virginia. And remember, there was no state of West Virginia at this point, so think of Virginia and West Virginia combined. But western Virginia, mountainous region, where you're not going to go cash crops, and therefore you're not going to have very many slaves, was anti-secession. And in fact, in 1863, the western counties of Virginia are going to break away and form a new state, West Virginia. That's where West Virginia comes from. But McClellan's success here, although relatively minor, looked very large from a strategic perspective. It was. It looked more impressive militarily than, in fact, it was. And that made McClellan look like the guy to pull the defeated Bull Run army together. And so he was brought to Washington, and he was put in charge of what he would now call the Army of the Potomac. And this would be the principal Union army in the Eastern theater during the war. And in some regards, McClellan was a very good choice. He was strategically very competent. He excelled at training troops and organizing men. He revived the spirits of the defeated Union army. He made sure it was expertly trained, exceptionally well equipped. He had a bond with his troops that was really remarkable. They trusted him, they loved him, and he sort of felt the same way about them. And the Lincoln administration deferred to him. Lincoln deferred to him. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, deferred to him. He was given enormous latitude, and even though old Winfield Scott is still technically General-in-Chief, even he seems to defer to McClellan. Eventually, all of this goes to McClellan's head. He comes to view Lincoln as an imbecile, as Scott and Stanton as roadblocks and troublemakers, and McClellan's ego is going to get the better of him. He's going to call Lincoln things like a baboon and a moron, and really, thinks that he's much smarter than the men who are running the administration, who he denigrates as callow politicians. And it doesn't help that McClellan's a Democrat, Lincoln's a Republican, and McClellan believes that the war should be waged in a way that causes the least amount of damage and the fewest casualties possible, so that it will be easier to put together the country when the fighting is over. And he also believes that the war should be waged for conservative purposes, that is, to restore the Union exactly like it was before the war, that there should be no touching of slavery or interference with constitutional rights, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, under McClellan, when slaves run away from their owners and enter the lines of the Union Army, they're returned to their secessionist masters. Lincoln and the Congress, at least publicly, are on the same page. They made it very clear that this was a war that was being waged for the preservation of the Union and for no other purpose. Remember, Lincoln acknowledges that slavery is constitutional. In the states where it exists, the federal government has no real power over it. He wants to, as do the Republicans, stop the spread of slavery, which of course the Southerners see as a slow death for the institution. But he does not want this war to be about slavery, to the great disgust of the abolitionists who want this war to be about slavery. You say, look, the slavery is the poison that causes causes all the political problems that led to secession, the Congress and Lincoln don't agree. In fact, the Congress passes a resolution that says this is a war about saving the Union. But McClellan knows that there are radical elements of the Republican Party, abolitionist elements of the Republican Party, who feel very differently. And he suspects that Lincoln probably does too, and that they really don't want an early victory because that would pull the rug out from under their hopes of making the war about slavery. And this McClellan, of course, is wrong. Lincoln very famously says that he would do whatever it takes to save the Union. If that meant freeing all the slaves, he would do it. If it meant freeing none of the slaves, he would do that. If it meant freeing some and leaving others as slaves, he would do that. But his single goal is to save the Union. And he looks to McClellan to do that. And eventually, as the Army of the Potomac becomes a force of 120,000 well-trained, beautifully equipped men, everybody is looking for McClellan to use that army to go after the Confederates at Manassas, who are now under the command of Joseph E. Johnston. Beauregard's been transferred west to be second command to Albert Sidney Johnston after the disasters at Henry and Donelson. McClellan does not want to move. First, winter shows up. And remember that in the 18th and 19th century, armies have a very hard time campaigning in winter. It's not impossible. It's very difficult because, the roads are dirt, and in snow and rain, they become bought up with quagmires of mud, and so movement and supply is exceptionally difficult. So McClellan says, well, it's wintertime, I can't really do anything. And also, he doesn't want to advance straight south from Washington toward Richmond and have to fight his way across all those rivers that are in his way. So what he wants to do is put his army on boats, use the Union's vast naval superiority, and outflank the Confederates at Manassas by sailing down the Chesapeake Bay and landing his army at Fort Monroe, which is a fort in Virginia that the North managed to hold on to when the state seceded. Fort Monroe is at the tip of a peninsula of land that is formed by the York River to the north and the James River to the south. And we know this peninsula of land very well because, of course, on the James River you have that little island called Jamestown where the first successful English colony in the world had been established, and just a handful of miles away, really, on the York River, you have that little tobacco port called Yorktown, where Cornwallis had met his end and the British Empire in North America had finally really been consigned to its doom. Fort Monroe's here, Richmond's here on this peninsula of land, and if I go down here, I outflank Johnston and I can rush in and grab Richmond before the Confederates can get in my way. Strategically speaking, it's a good plan. The problem for McClellan is that Johnston gets wind of it, and he's going to be able to get in front of McClellan's troops, and it's going to take a while for those troops, of course, to make that long waterborne movement. So the Federals are having a bit of strategic debate in the East. What makes Lincoln nervous is that if the Army of the Potomac under McClellan goes down to this peninsula, then might not Joe Johnston's army take advantage of its absence to dash into Washington and capture the federal capital? And the Federals have begun to build a lot of fortifications around Washington, D.C. McClellan believes that there's no real threat here, but Lincoln is nervous, and so he requires McClellan to leave ample troop strength to defend Washington, and McClellan agrees to do that. And so at that point in March of 1862, McClellan begins his movement, and as he shifts his army down to the peninsula, Lincoln looks at the troops that he has left behind and becomes dissatisfied. McClellan had counted units that were in the Shenandoah Valley as defending Washington. That's militarily not unreasonable, but those men looked like they were very far away as far as Lincoln was concerned. He counted new green troops who on a battlefield would be almost useless. And the upshot of it is that McClellan believed that he was doing what Lincoln wanted. Lincoln believed that McClellan had been dishonest, and therefore he kept back an entire Army Corps from McClellan's army to defend Washington. He said, as soon as you're close to Richmond, I'll have them march south through Virginia to join you. But this made McClellan very angry. McClellan believes through dint of very poorly analyzed intelligence that the Confederates under Joe Johnston defending Richmond vastly outnumber him. There's like 200,000 Confederates defending Richmond compared to 100,000 Federals, and of course this was completely ridiculous. The Confederates did not outnumber the Federals at all. In fact, they were somewhat weaker than the Federals, and at certain points in the campaign, the Federals outnumbered the Confederates 10 or 15 to 1. Until Johnson could get his whole army down to Richmond. But McClellan is acting on the intelligence he believes. He intends to make a slow, methodical campaign, digging in as he goes, relying on artillery to blast holes in Confederate lines so that he doesn't have to have costly infantry assaults. The whole idea is to put his army in a position where it can fight one great, big, decisive battle around Richmond and win the war, and thus win the war with the minimum amount of damage and bloodshed, which will make putting the Union back together the way that it was a viable option. And so McClellan, who is cautious by nature, is moving very slowly, very timidly up the peninsula. The Confederate delaying tactics are excellent, but nonetheless, the Federals are sort of remorselessly advancing on Richmond. The Confederates are not able to do much about it, and in part because Joseph E. Johnston, who's commanding the Confederate Army defending Richmond, is a lot like McClellan. He's a cautious general who looks at the odds and says, I can't fight this guy. He outnumbers me, and so all I can do is continue to pull back and hope that some opening appears. For Confederate President Jefferson Davis, of course, this is intolerable. If Johnston keeps backing up, sooner or later he's going to back up all the way out of Richmond. And so Davis is getting very nervous. And of course, if the Union troops in Northern Virginia around Washington march south to join McDowell, or join McClellan, then the game is up. Once they arrive, the Federals will so badly outnumber the Confederate defenders of Richmond that the capital will be lost. Something has to be done to keep those Union troops from coming south, and the man who comes up with the idea of what should be done is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, who is now a general in the Confederate Army. He is Jefferson Davis's military advisor. He, of course, is a Virginian and a brilliant military tactician and strategist. And he suggests that the Confederate troops in the Shenandoah Valley, who are now under the command of Stonewall Jackson, stage a diversion to threaten Washington, D.C. And so he sends word to Jackson to launch this diversion. Jackson not only follows those orders, he follows those orders brilliantly, and he wages something called the Valley Campaign that will run from through most of May of 1862. He lunges toward Washington. That makes Lincoln nervous. Lincoln sends troops in to try and destroy Jackson, and in a series of brilliant maneuvers over a period of weeks, Jackson outmarches and he outfights and he outthinks the Federals. He beats 3 separate Yankee armies and basically keeps all of these troops that were supposed to be coming south to support McClellan around Washington, D.C. So this Valley Campaign has enormous strategic importance, as well as enhancing the reputation of Stonewall Jackson, who is one of the best of the Confederate generals. And so while this is going on, and the Federals are inching closer and closer to Richmond, out in the west, Albert Sidney Johnston has recognized that the odds are growing longer against him as well. And there are 2 Federal armies, one under Grant, the Army of the Tennessee. The Federals named their armies after rivers. The Confederates named their armies after states. So the Army of the Tennessee River, under Grant, has advanced out of its victories in northern Tennessee at Henry and Donelson to southern Tennessee and to a little place called Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. and there they are awaiting the arrival of another federal army, the Army of the Cumberland, under the command of General Don Carlos Buell. Once these two armies get together, they'll outnumber Albert Sidney Johnston's Army of Mississippi around Corinth, almost 2-1 or better. And Johnston says, I have to keep that from happening. And so in a very daring move, he pulls together almost all the Confederate troops in the West. So he takes most of the troops away from New Orleans, from places like Pensacola. He uses rail to concentrate them at Corinth. And then in early April of 1862, he advances to attack Grant's army at Pittsburgh Landing. It's camped in fields and woods around a little church meeting house called Shiloh Church. And against all odds, the Confederates managed to stage a surprise attack on Grant's army, and that first day they push it back toward the Tennessee River. They inflict enormous damage. This is incredibly brutal battle. The troops on both sides are largely green, but they're exceptionally brave. They tear at each other with the tenacity of veterans. Casualties are enormous. In the midst of the fighting, Albert Sidney Johnston is mortally wounded. He bleeds to death on the battlefield. Tourniquet could have saved him, but he had sent his personal surgeon off to take care of federal wounded, and so there was nobody there to administer that life-saving aid. When Johnston dies, Beauregard takes over, tries to continue the offensive, pushes Grant's army basically right up against the Tennessee River, but can't quite finish him off before nightfall. And overnight, the leading elements of Buell's army arrive. Grant is able to stage a counterattack the next day that in bitter fighting pushes the Confederates back to their starting point, at which juncture Beauregard breaks off the action and retreats back to Corinth, and that means that the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, as the Confederates called it, or the Battle of Shiloh, as the Federals called it, you can use either name, was a federal victory. But it was a federal victory that came at a shocking cost. 40,000 Federals had fought 33,000 Confederates, and each side had lost 12,000 men. So in 2 days of fighting at Shiloh, 24,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured. And that means that more men, more Americans fell in the Battle of Shiloh in those first 2 days than had fallen in all American wars previous to this, put together. So take all of the casualties of the Revolution, take all of the casualties of the War of 1812, take all of the casualties of the Mexican War, add in all of the losses in the wars against the Indians, and you do not get as many men who were killed, wounded, or captured at the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh, therefore, has some very important consequences. It's a horrible wake-up call for both sides, that this war is not going to be quick. This war is not going to be easy. The other guy is in earnest. He can fight, and he will fight. The casualties at Shiloh sort of set the trend. There were 6,000 casualties at Bull Run, about 3,000 each side. And though they were shocking, they weren't that far out of line of what had happened in previous wars. But now what had happened at Shiloh was unlike anything anyone had experienced before, and it sets a trend. It's not uncommon for armies, whether they win or lose a battle in the American Civil War, to suffer 20, 25%, 30, 35% casualties. We have a battle in modern times where you have 10% losses. That's considered a bloodbath. Well, 10% would have hardly been a skirmish in a Civil War battle. And so this was a great shock. It also, the Battle of Shiloh, of course, removes Albert Sidney Johnston from the scene, which is a blow to the Confederacy, but it also smears Grant's reputation. Grant had been taken by surprise because he was overconfident. He had actually done pretty well after being taken by surprise. He had not become flustered. He hadn't lost his nerve. He had stood and fought and had eventually won. But the fact that he was taken by surprise in this very, very bloody battle whose casualties shocked the country made it look like Grant had blundered. And it was at this point that people began to remember his pre-war career. He'd done very well in the Mexican War. Grant was a West Pointer, but assigned to boring frontier post, Grant had become very lonely. He missed his wife Julia, who he loved a great deal, and when Grant was bored and lonely, he started drinking, and it turns out that he was rather susceptible to alcoholism, and he had gotten a reputation as a drunk, and had been forced to resign from the Army. And as a civilian, he had not done well. He had failed at every endeavor he had undertaken, at being a farmer, at being a debt collector. When the war began, he was working for his father as a clerk in a leather goods store. Grant had talents. He was an expert horseman in a day and age where that was something that people paid attention to. He was, by all accounts, a loving father and husband, and of course he has real military talents, and he's exhibited those at Henry and Donaldson, but it seems like he hasn't at Shiloh. And there were rumors that started to float around. Grant's drinking again. You know he's a drunk. That's probably why this happened. And there were people who urged Lincoln to get rid of Grant. But Grant was one of the few Union generals who was going forward to fight. And in contrast to McClellan, he was an aggressive fellow. And Lincoln said, I can't spare this man. He fights. And when people said, well, he's a drunk, he said, well, find out what kind of whiskey he drinks, and I'll send some to my other generals. And maybe that will help them. Albert Sidney Johnston has made this very bold bid to reverse the tide for the Confederates in the West, and although he'd come close, he had ultimately failed. Out in the Trans-Mississippi, things no better. The Confederate Army there under Major General Earl Van Doren had been ordered to come east to help Johnston in the attack on Shiloh. If he had actually gotten there, it might have made all the difference. But Earl Van Doren decides that before he comes east of the river, he's going to try and destroy the Union Army in northern Arkansas. And so in early March, in exceptionally cold weather, he launches an attack on the Federals that leads to a battle called Pea Ridge. And again, it's like Shiloh. The first day, the Confederates do very well, but on the second day, the tide turns against them, and they are beaten. And so there's been a defeat at Pea Ridge. In Arkansas, there's been this defeat at Shiloh. Albert Sidney Johnston's been killed. The Federals are advancing slowly but steadily against Richmond. The only bright spot has been Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign. That's encouraging, but it seems like it's a little bit off stage center, and that's not helpful. The Federals are rolling along the Mississippi River. In early April, they capture a key fort at a place called Island Number 10 that opens the way for them to make an attack on Memphis. On April 25th, a Federal fleet under Admiral David Farragut manages to capture the city of New Orleans, which had been denuded of troops by Albert Sidney Johnston for his Shiloh offensive. The Federals, in fact, are going to be sweeping down and up the Mississippi River very quickly. On June 6th, they capture Memphis after defeating a small Confederate naval flotilla. And so this looks like the North is going to capture the entire length of the Mississippi River and do so very quickly. In the Eastern Theater, things are looking just as bad. Not only is McClellan steadily approaching Richmond, Jefferson Davis finally insists that Joseph E. Johnston fight to defend the Confederate capital. And so on May 31st of 1862, Johnston had launched an attack against McClellan. It was a badly managed affair by both sides, green troops, green officers, bad roads. The Battle of Fair Oaks, or Seven Pines, as it was also called, is a stalemate, kind of a draw tactically, doesn't change the strategic situation at all, except that in the waning hours of the fight, Joseph E. Johnston is badly wounded, and he will recover. We will see him again, but he's carried from the field on a stretcher. And at that point, Jefferson Davis makes probably what is one of the most important decisions of the entire war, perhaps the most important decision of the entire war, and that is he appoints Robert E. Lee to be the commander of the Confederate forces defending Richmond. And Lee renames that force the Army of Northern Virginia. The name that army will carry for the rest of the war. It will become, along with the Army of the Potomac, one of the most famous armies in American history. And Lee now is in charge, and that's going to make a huge difference. So when we enter the month of June, disaster for the Confederates on every front, and it looks like the war is all but over. In fact, the North is so confident that it's about to finish this thing off, it shuts down its recruiting offices. We don't need more soldiers. We basically have won this thing. But as I said, the war is sort of like a pendulum swinging back and forth, and now it swings in favor of the Confederates. Out in Mississippi, the Federal Navy, sweeping up and down the river, run into a place called Vicksburg, a city that sits on high bluffs overlooking a sharp turn in the Mississippi River, a place where boats have to slow down to negotiate that water course. Confederate cannon up there cannot be hit by Union cannon on ships far below in the river, and Vicksburg refuses to surrender, and it becomes the linchpin of Confederate defenses on the Mississippi. And although the Federals are going to try and deal with it, they're going to fail. Initially, the Confederates build an ironclad called the Arkansas that comes down and battles the Union fleet and forces it basically to retreat away from Vicksburg, at which point the Confederates go 100 miles downstream to a place called Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is similarly situated as Vicksburg on bluffs overlooking the river, and they fortify that. And so when it looked like the Confederates were about to lose the entire Mississippi, suddenly they have a critical 100-mile stretch of it, held by the forts of Vicksburg to the north and the fortifications of Port Hudson to the south. The Red River flows into the Mississippi between those 2 points, and so connection with the Trans-Mississippi and the supplies of the Trans-Mississippi is maintained. And the Federals, who looked like they were about to have overwhelming success in the Mississippi, have now been stymied. And in the center of the Western Theater, after Grant's embarrassment at Shiloh, a new man has taken command, Major General Henry W. Halleck. He, a West Point graduate, a very distinguished officer from an academic perspective. His nickname was Old Brains. He was a very wealthy Californian. He's come back in a uniform when the war broke out. He's got overall command of the Union armies. So he is leading a very slow, methodical advance against Beauregard's troops, who have fortified around the railroad junction of Corinth, the place from which Albert Sidney Johnston had launched his attack at Shiloh, and to which the Confederates had retreated after that battle. Beauregard's army is in very bad shape. It's only 30,000 men. A lot of them are sick because the water in this region of Tennessee was very bad. But Halleck is being very careful after Shiloh. No more surprises, he says. And so he's making a very methodical advance, entrenching as he goes, sort of like McClellan is entrenching as he goes closer and closer to Richmond. Eventually, Halleck is going to capture Corinth, but Beauregard's going to get his army away. He's going to sneak away. There's not going to be a big battle, and so it's an empty triumph that's very disappointing to the North. Beauregard goes on sick leave after this, and he's replaced by North Carolinian General Braxton Bragg. He will take command of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, as he renames it. But although the North makes some progress by capturing Corinth, after that capture, Halleck sort of disperses the troops to occupy a lot of this territory that he's just won, and the northern offensive there sputters out. So the northern tide goes into reverse along the Mississippi. It kind of grinds to a halt in Tennessee, and in Virginia, it's thrown into reverse because Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia are going to be the best Confederate general with the best Confederate army. And Lee has Stonewall Jackson come down and join him from the Shenandoah Valley. And at the end of June of 1862, he counterattacks McClellan, who still believes that he is grossly outnumbered. And in a week-long series of battles, he shoves him away from Richmond, back down to the James River and the protection of Union naval forces. This is called the 7 Days Battle, which is the culmination of what is known as the Peninsula Campaign. The fighting is very brutal in this series of combats. But the Confederates triumph Despite heavy casualties, they capture enormous quantities of supplies, rifles, and ammunition and artillery, which of course the South desperately needs. And this catapults Lee up in the eyes of the Southern people. He becomes, and rightfully so, the greatest of the Confederate generals, and he has saved Richmond. He has saved Richmond. And he's completely undone McClellan, who blames Lincoln for this defeat because Lincoln would not send him reinforcements, and he's badly outnumbered. And in this instance, Lincoln decides to bring Halleck from the west and make him general-in-chief of the Union armies. So Winfield Scott had retired long before. McClellan had briefly held the job, but Lincoln had taken away from him once he led his army to the peninsula. So Halleck is now in charge of the Union war effort, and he goes down to see McClellan on the peninsula to see if the campaign might be renewed. And McClellan says, "Well, give me, lots and lots of more troops, and I will take Richmond." And Halleck says, "Well, I don't have those troops." And McClellan says, "Well, I've got to have them." And at this point, Halleck realizes that no matter how many troops he tries to give McClellan, not that there are many troops available, McClellan is not going to resume the offensive. And so at that juncture, Halleck and Lincoln decide to withdraw McClellan's army from the peninsula, bring it back up to Washington, D.C. The idea here is that they can't fire McClellan. He's politically too popular. His troops love him too much, but they can take all of his troops away from him bit by bit by bit and reduce his importance in the Union war effort. In Northern Virginia, all of those soldiers who had been trying to catch Stonewall Jackson have now been collected together in a new Union army, the Army of Virginia, under the command of Major General John Pope, who had won some victories out west. He's been brought to the east, and he's going to attempt to get at Richmond by marching south from Washington. Lee leaves a handful of troops to keep an eye on McClellan's army, which is slowly evacuating the peninsula, and he and Jackson race north and attack Pope at a second Battle of Manassas in late August of 1862, and they defeat him very badly and rout his army, which flees back into Washington. So it's Bull Run all over again. That forces Lincoln to recall McClellan, put him in command of the combined Army of Virginia and Army of the Potomac with orders to defend Washington, which is, of course, now a very tricky thing because Lee's army, having won the 7 Days battles, having won the Battle of Second Manassas, has crossed the Potomac and invaded the North. It's entered Maryland in hopes that this would spur Maryland to secede. Doesn't. Lincoln's got too tight a grip on the state for that to happen. But Lee is now in the north, and at the same time as Lee is invading Maryland, the Confederate forces in the west under General Braxton Bragg have gone over to the offensive as well. When Halleck spread everybody out after the capture of Corinth, then Bragg sees an opportunity. Once again, using the railroads, he collects his army together, transfers it from Corinth to Chattanooga, Tennessee, in eastern part of the state, and then in conjunction with the Confederate Army under Edmund Kirby Smith, they invade Kentucky. So the Confederates are invading Kentucky. The Federal Army has to leave Tennessee, go into Kentucky to try and defend the state, so that in the fall of 1862, now the Confederates are on the offensive. The Confederate Army invading Kentucky, heading toward Lexington and Frankfort. Confederate Army under Lee in Virginia. The Confederates suddenly seem to be doing very well, and all the North's gains seem to have disappeared. And this leads England and France to begin to consider very seriously recognizing the Confederacy and demanding an end to the war. And of course, if the North is not willing to have a mediation to the end of the conflict, then possibly England and France enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, at least from a naval perspective. Lincoln recognizes that given this reversal of the tide, the enormous cost of the war in terms of blood and money, Union resolve is weakening. that therefore he needs to do something to reinvigorate the North cause, to keep England and France out, to try and convince the Confederates to give up, and to elevate the Northern cause from something beyond the sort of theoretical, we must save the Union, to something more. And so he proposes emancipation. He proposes issuing a threat to emancipate the slaves if the South does not give up the war by January 1st of 1863. And his cabinet tells him that he can't do that from a position of weakness, that he has to wait until there's a Union victory. And that Union victory, it looks like it's very far off, but Lincoln agrees, and so he has to wait. That victory is going to come in September of 1862. So as Lee invades Maryland, he spreads his army out. He sends a good chunk of it to capture a large Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. He has taken the measure of McClellan. McClellan is cautious. He's slow. Lee can have a separated army and live off the land until it's time to concentrate and fight McClellan at a time and a place of Lee's choosing. But unfortunately for Lee, his orders that send his troops off in different directions are accidentally lost by an officer. They're fortuitously found by Union soldiers who send them to McClellan. McClellan now realizes Lee's army spread out. If he moves quickly, he can destroy it piece by piece. But McClellan doesn't really move quickly. The Confederates put up a stout rearguard action that slows him down, and Lee has time to get his army back together, and he makes a stand behind a little creek called the Antietam near a town known as Sharpsburg, not very far from the Potomac River in Maryland. McClellan comes up slowly, cautiously, waits a few days to attack. That gives Lee time to pull his army together and get ready for the Federal assault, which finally comes on September 17th of 1862. That day becomes the bloodiest day in American history. The Battle of Sharpsburg, as the Confederates called it, the Battle of Antietam, as the Federals called it, was a closely fought contest. It waxed and waned. The Federals broke the Confederate lines. The Confederates counterattacked and plugged the holes in their lines. The fighting was brutal, exceptionally vicious, and at the end of the day, Lee has managed to hold his lines. McClellan had an entire Army Corps that he could have thrown in. If he had done it, he would have probably destroyed Lee's army, and that would have taken the Union pretty close to winning the war. But McClellan does not do that because he still believes that he is outnumbered. And so Lee's army holds its ground. And having held its ground through September 17th, he waits an entire day on the 18th, although his lines are very thin, daring McClellan to renew the attack, which McClellan declines to do. And the next day, that Lee retreats back into Virginia. And this allows the Federals to claim the battle as a victory. A very costly victory. On September 17, 1862, 23,000 Americans, Northerners and Southerners, become casualties. So it is the bloodiest day in American history that has never been equaled. In a single day, you had as many casualties as you did in 2 days of fighting at Shiloh. Lee's army manages to successfully escape. McClellan does not follow for an entire month because his army is so shot up, and this is true in the Civil War. The army that loses a battle and an army that wins a battle are always equally shot to pieces as a result of the contest. It was one of the reasons that so few Civil War battles are truly decisive in their aftermath. At the Battle of Antietam, though, is going to have far greater consequences. It's 2 things are going to happen as a result of it. One of them is McClellan's failure to rapidly and aggressively pursue Lee. He's going to get him fired. He's going to get fired and replaced with Major General Ambrose Burnside. So McClellan is militarily going to exit the stage. He will be back politically, as we will see in 1864. The victory at Antietam is is the cue for Lincoln to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. A preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued on September 22nd of 1862. It tells the Confederates if they don't give up the war by January 1st of 1863, Lincoln is going to declare all slaves in Confederate-controlled territory to be free. Now, he can do this purely as a war measure. The Constitution gives the president enormous war power, and Lincoln is able to sell this to the Northern public as a necessary war measure. The slaves are supporting the Confederate war effort. In fact, the Federals have stopped returning runaway slaves, declaring them contraband of war. They keep them and put them to work for the Union cause. So if we free slaves, we weaken the Confederate war effort. We encourage those slaves to run away where they can be put to good use by the Union as laborers or as sailors or soldiers. We also make the war not only a war to save the Union, but also a war to destroy slavery. Destruction of slavery now becomes part of the Northern War goal, and that's going to keep anti-slavery England and France from recognizing the Confederacy and coming into the war on the side of the South. They'll continue to sell her arms and supplies, loan her money, build her warships, but they're not going to fight with her to recognize an independent Confederacy. And of course, this bolsters Northern war goals. The Union as a political construct might not be worth all the lives and all the treasure that have been expended and will be needed to be expended going forward, but what price does one put on the institution of human slavery? This, of course, is also a way to punish rebels and what the North saw as traitors for secession. This is going to strike at the Southern aristocracy and Southern political and economic power. And although not all Northerners will agree with it, some will consider it too little, some will consider it too weak. Some regiments will say we didn't join up to destroy slavery, and they'll throw down their arms and go home. There's actually very little of that. Of course, the Confederates are going to point at this threat and say, well, there it is. We told you this is why we seceded. This is what Lincoln had in his head all along. Not true, but of course, useful propaganda for the South. The Confederates, of course, are not going to give up the war by January 1st of 1863, and that means that chances for a negotiated peace now disappear. This is going to be a war to the bitter end. A few days after Lincoln issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation at the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky, there's a fight. It's a drawn battle, not nearly as bloody as what you got in Antietam, but it convinces Braxton Bragg that Kentucky's not ready to secede either, and so he decides to withdraw from Kentucky. So as October dawns, the Confederate tide has receded, and the war is going to go swinging back in favor of the Union. It remains to be seen whether the North can accomplish anything in the waning months of 1862, but it's going to get the chance. So the Battle of Antietam had been a decisive diplomatic, political, moral turning point in the war. It's interesting to think about it, though. If that battle had turned out any other way than it did, there might not have been an Emancipation Proclamation. If Lee had beaten McClellan, then Lincoln has no opportunity to issue the Emancipation. England and France, which were at that point very close to coming into the war on the side of the South, might have actually done so. The course of events would have been entirely differently. If McClellan had thrown in all of his troops and had destroyed Lee's army, then the war probably comes to an end fairly quickly, and Lincoln has no reason to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It had to be a stalemated battle. The Confederates retreat. That allows the North to claim a victory, but by successfully retreating, Lee keeps his army alive, he keeps the war going, and therefore Lincoln has the reason to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you want to ask who is responsible for making emancipation part of the war, well, Lincoln, obviously, and most importantly, but he couldn't have done it without both George McClellan and Robert E. Lee. All three of them together combine to produce the result at the Battle of Antietam that allow the Emancipation Proclamation to be put on the table. And so the war is going to go on. We've gone through the first part of it. In our next lecture, we will pick up the struggle in November and December of 1862, and then carry the war through to its conclusion. Remember to look at the maps that I'm going to email you, and now the questions that you need to answer and send back to me. So question number 1, name of the 2 forts captured by Grant in February of 1862 that made him a hero. What's the name of the 2 forts that Grant captured in February of 1862 that made him a hero? Question number 2, what's the name of the Union general who was an expert at organizing and training troops, but who despised Lincoln and launched a cautious advance up the peninsula toward Richmond? What's the name of the Union general who was an expert at training and organizing troops, but who despised Lincoln and led a slow, cautious advance up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond? Next, question number 3, what's the name of the battle that gave Lincoln the opening to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? What's the name of the battle that allowed Lincoln the opening to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? Question number 4, what is the name of the Confederate general who staged a brilliant campaign in the Shenandoah Valley that threatened Washington and scared Lincoln? What's the name of the Confederate general who staged a brilliant campaign in the Shenandoah Valley that threatened Washington and scared Lincoln? And finally, question number 5, what is the name of the Texas general, the Texas Confederate general who was killed at the Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing? What is the name of the Confederate general from Texas who was killed at the Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing? So send in those questions to me. Go on to listen to the next lecture where we deal with the second half of the Civil War, and then look for the essay questions by email in very short order. So I hope all of you continue to do well, and I will look forward to seeing you on video next time.